Hey guys, what is up? Public back with another video, and today this is the third section of the guide for Shadowlands opening patch 9.0.2 or 1, whatever it is, I forget. And today we're going to go over the rotation. This is going to include your opener, things to keep in mind while AoEing, all that great stuff, right? Now I will say, a lot of this content, in my opinion, is somewhat hard to digest in video form, so I would say use this as kind of like a template. I'll put as much background footage as I can that's kind of relevant to what I'm talking about. But I'll have a link in the description. My Icy Veins guide that I wrote has a very detailed rotation that almost mimics exactly what the sim is doing if you ever are running sims. So in today's video, I'm going to go over each of those steps and kind of the thought process that I use and the sim uses while doing your rotation as a Shadow Priest. All right, let's go ahead and get started. Okay, so first things first, if you haven't seen the other two parts of the guide, we already went over talents and kind of how to prep for your Shadow Priest. So if you're curious about any of that stuff, make sure you check those guys out. And then coming tomorrow and the day after, we'll have stuff on Castle Nathri and Mythic Plus as a Shadow Priest. But today we're going over the opener of the rotation. So let's go ahead and get into the opener specifically. This is how you're going to start almost every fight. And so I'll put this on the right side of me here. This is actually pretty set in stone and static. There isn't a whole lot of dynamic parts of this bit of the rotation. However, after you get to this point, things do get a bit more fluid based on, you know, what talents you're running, what cooldowns you have coming up, and all that good stuff. Okay, so you've probably noticed that with the opener, we're actually pre-casting with Vampiric Touch. This is almost entirely because we have our new mastery now where our Mind Blast or whatever we cast will do more damage if we have dots on that target. So because of this, it's better to do Vampiric Touch, Shadowrunner Pain first in the opener, and then do that opening Mind Blast if you're talented, based on your talents. Otherwise, you're just kind of just losing out on that mastery damage. Now, that being said, we actually don't do the Mind Blast right away if you're talented into Void Torrent. This is very, very important to get Void Torrent on cooldown as fast as possible. It's like probably our hardest hitting single spell that we can cast right now, depending on the damage ticks that you're talking about. So what you're doing here is basically you're putting up Vampiric Touch and Shadowward Pain. Depending on you're talented into Misery or not, you'll drop the Shadowward Pain. And then you go right into Void Torrent. Now, the one caveat I'll put here, this is probably the only time I'll do this, there are a couple on-use trinkets that are delayed in giving you that stat buff. So Imperial Ordnance is one of these guys. If you have this trinket, make sure you use this before your Void Torrent here. You do kind of want to line things up with that Intellect buff and your Void form. There are a couple other trinkets to do that as well. So if you're ever curious, make sure you just check your sim output. It'll actually tell you exactly what that is doing for each of those trinkets. So moving on, after that Void Torrent, or if you're not talented into that, the thing you want to keep in mind is you can cast a Devouring Plague before opening up into that first Void form, only if you're getting into like very high levels of insanity, like around the 80 or 90 mark. Otherwise, you're going to immediately go into your Shadow Crash or Mind Blast, depending on what you have talented, and then go right into your Void Form cycle. Now, before you enter into Void Form, it's very important. You have two things that you want to make sure that you're casting, depending on your Covenant, which is you want to use Shadow Fiend right before Void Form. That global just isn't worth it inside of it, but having the Insanity Gen is good. You just want to cast it right before to get that Insanity going into Void Form. And then also Fey Guardians. So if you're the Night Fey Covenant, you want to use Fey Guardians right before Void Form. Again, same kind of reason. Inside the opener, using Fey Guardians inside of Void Form is not the best. It is kind of crowded for global cooldowns in there right now, because things like Void Bolt, you have 2 charges of Mind Blast, Devouring Plague, all that good stuff. You do kind of want to prioritize those over the CDR Void Eruption. So you'll miss out on like 1 GCD or 2 of that CDR. In the long run, that's better than desyncing the cooldown too much. So once you cast both those two guys, you're basically right into going into Void Form. Now again, if you're not talented into Shadow Crash or Void Torrent, you're probably going to need to kind of sit by and do some Mind Flays before actually getting into Void Form, which is fine. I suggest you usually don't want to get into Void Form until you have about 30 to 40 Insanity. And this is primarily because you really want that first Void Bolt after you hit Void Eruption to give you enough Insanity to get a Devouring Plague off. The main point of this is you're always going to want to cast that Void Bolt if you're talented into Hungering Void. And then outside of that, Void Form's whole goal is for Void Bolt and Devouring Plague cast as much as possible inside of Void Form. So doing that around 30 or 40 Insanity will give you the best chance of success at that. And then generally speaking, you'll cast Power Infusion after the Void Eruption cast finishes. Although before or after, doesn't really matter in the long run. Whatever I'd say is easier for you to manage. Although technically doing it right after is usually what I like to do. Now again, after that, once you're inside of Void Form, I would consider then using most on-use trinket cooldowns here, especially if it's just like, hey, on-use gain a stat. Like, this is the time to use those, especially if they're longer cooldowns. You just got to keep in mind some of them do have like a delay or a ramp or something like that. So depending on like how long it takes for you to fully ramp the cooldown, you want the peaks to line up with where your void form is. And again, that will depend greatly on the trinkets that you have. So make sure you check the guide or the sim output to see what they're doing for those specific trinkets. Now after that, once you have that first void bolt used, depending on your insanity levels, you might also want to toss up a devouring plague again right after that first void bolt. If you're rocking real low on insanity, you can continue on, but generally speaking, inside of void form, you're going to be casting devouring plagues almost every 3 or 4 globals or so because of how much insanity generation you're going to have. So keep that in mind. Don't be afraid to do that. Again, your biggest thing with devouring plague, do not cap insanity and make sure it lasts as long as possible for mastery reasons. Now, outside of that, depending on your covenant, this is where you'll use any of the other 3 covenant abilities, whether that's Mind Games, Unholy Nova, or Boon of the Ascended. So these guys are the 3 that you'll actually end up using inside of Void form. Mind Games is is basically the easiest one to use in this case. It does scale with our mastery, so using it inside of Void form gets the full benefit of that mastery. And again, make sure you're waiting for that Hungering Void debuff on the target before using it. That's just free damage on the table. You want to make sure that you always have that with Mind Games whenever you're inside of Void form. Now again, on the opener, if you're the Necrolord Covenant with Unholy Nova, you can pop this basically any time after that Power Infusion goes up. You don't necessarily have to wait for that Hungering Void debuff, although I would suggest it. They do have some travel times. It can be a little finicky, but the main thing with Unholy Nova in that opener is that it's getting as much uptime, and ideally always 100% uptime with Power Infusion. As long as you're doing that, you're generally going to be okay. And the other guy here is Boon of the Ascended. I'll put up a quick thing here because Boon of the Ascended does get a little tricky. The opener is a bit more complex with Boon, simply because Boon does replace our Mind Flay filler and instead gives us Ascended Blast and Ascended Nova. Now, important to note that especially inside of Void form, you do not press Ascended Nova inside of Void form. Outside of Void form, you could, but again, with Boon of the Ascended, you're generally only going to be using this guy inside of Void form. And you're basically just going to be casting Ascended Blast on cooldown on that one single target, and you only weave in Nova on 2 or more targets. Now, because of that, you do need to kind of weave in your globals a little bit better here. You will have occasional, like less than 1 second downtime between these abilities, but effectively what you're going to end up doing is Ascended Blast is every other cast for you for that duration of Boon of the Ascended. It's going to give you some monster damage, especially if you're talented into the Pelagos Soulbind. You'll get big mastery from that. And again, use this graphic as kind of your shining light there. This is kind of like a snapshot of the opener. You can kind of see it'll just kind of start repeating after this. It's just kind of like a little bit of a sample sequence I pulled from a sim. And now again, the rest of the rotation will continue on after here. At this point, your opener's effectively done. All of your stuff has been used on cooldown, or they should have been. And basically from here on out, you're just going to be following the Devouring Plague rule, right? This is the dominating force throughout the rest of the rotation. Again, you want to keep Devouring Plague up as long as possible from a mastery perspective, right? Every dot we have on a target increases our damage done to that target by our abilities, which includes Devouring Plague. So you don't just want to refresh every time you get 50 insanity. You do kind of want to spread that out as long as possible. Ideally, when there's like a second or so left of the dot is when it's safe to refresh. But at the same time, it's very important that you do not cap your insanity, right? So if you're at 90 insanity, you should definitely use Devouring Plague, even if it has, longer than 1 second remaining, because that's kind of the big fight between the rotation, right? Okay, let's move on to the rest of the rotation, kind of go over some big highlights I want to talk about. Okay, again, I'm not going to go kind of word for word what's in the guide. You can read that if you'd like. Our rotation, for the most part, is going to follow a basic priority list of spells that's going to be very similar to what we have in the opener. The real big things you want to keep in mind are more or less our mastery and then just kind of importance of your cooldowns, right? For the most part, holding cooldowns is going to be a bad idea, and that's kind of the shining light of the rest of the rotation. The only reason you ever want to save your cooldowns is if, like, there's a damage amp phase coming up, there are ads coming, but you want to be very careful because holding cooldowns too long could cost you an extra use of that cooldown in that duration of the encounter. And so because of this, you'll find that for the most part, we're going to use things like Void Form and Power Infusion on cooldown, independent of each other. You don't exactly want to sync them. The only reason that we're going to sync our cooldowns in these cases is if, hey, the boss only has like 45 seconds left. I do have Void Form, but PI doesn't come up for 10 seconds. Well, in that case, you're not going to get a second cast of Void Form. So you want to make sure that you do line it up there in the instance of, oh, hey, this is the last one of the encounter that I'm going to get. make sure you hold that. This is where having a fight timer is very, very critical. You can look at average kill times, whatever you want to do, and then get a time to die tracker. I know I personally use the one built into Exorcist Raid Tools to help me kind of estimate this. But this can be applied to more than just Void Eruption and Power Infusion. Same goes for Shadow Crash and Void Torrent, things like that, these kind of smaller cooldowns. Because they're so short, this is actually even more important. Holding them for longer than 10 seconds is usually a big bad idea, because then you're, again, almost definitely probably going to cost yourself a use of the cooldown. So be very, very careful with that. The only real reason I would save Shadow Crash these days, if you have ads coming in about 10 seconds or less, then absolutely save it in that case. Void Torrent, same kind of thing. Generally, once you're getting to like very high target counts, Void Torrent stops being useful. So be very, very careful with that. So if if there are like 7-8 ads up right now, maybe hold Void Form until the ads are dead and then nuke that priority target. So use your best judgment there. It is not AoE, as you guys know. Other things to keep in mind with the rotation, we already mentioned things like Devouring Plague. Now we do have a new spell added into this expansion, which is Shadow Word Death. You want to make sure Shadow Word Death is basically only used below 20%. Now again, the mastery rule still applies here, just like everything else. You want to make sure ideally the target has all 3 dots available or up on it before you cast Shadow Word Death. It's got a fairly lengthy cooldown, so doing that by saving a little bit is okay. Just be a little careful. Now, of course, you can use Shadow Word Death above 20%. This is not something you're generally going to do almost ever, especially considering it does deal damage to yourself, so be a little careful about using this. However, if you are doing kind of movement on your Shadow Priest, where you have to move from, say, one end of the room to the other, you can use things like Void Bolt, Devouring Plagues, all these instant cast abilities help move. Shadow Word Death is kind of in that list as well. So, of course, you can just spam Shadow Word Pain while moving to do something, or even Power Word Shield to get you there faster. But you can also just use Shadow Word Death as one of the globals while you're moving from point A to point B. Above 20%, this is okay. It's just slightly better than spamming Shadow Word Pain, so you can do a Shadow Word Death and then kind of go hand with Shadow Word Pain after that. So moving on there with just kind of going down the list of all of our cooldowns here. Surrender to Madness. So let's talk about Surrender to Madness real quick. So this is a talent that does have a bit of finicky uses in that it just gives you a Void Form, right? So how do we use that? Well, primarily speaking, Surrender to Madness is just there for the Void Form. It does give you extra Insanity Generation and Cast While Moving abilities for that 25-second duration, assuming the mob lives for that. So the only thing you want to keep in mind here, we're primarily in it for the Void Form. So the big purpose is to get as much Void Form uptime as possible. Now, the tricky part with Surrender to Madness to keep in mind is if you already have Void Form active and you press Surrender to Madness, you don't get an extra Void Form. So be very, very careful about that. Make sure you're only using it when you don't have that currently active. And at that point, again, the same cooldown rule applies. You're in this to get as many uses of that cooldown as possible, and make sure you're doing that. If you can do that, you're going to be great with Surrender to Madness. It's going to be a great tool in Mythic Plus and Dungeons. So there you go. That's really all you need to keep in mind. Now, we already mentioned Shadow Fiend and Mindbender as kind of, you want to press that in your opener at that point. Outside the opener, Shadow Fiend and Mindbender are more or less going to be used on cooldown. The same cooldown syncing applies, though. Ideally, you're getting that Insanity Generation when you need it, but holding that cooldown, again, usually not going to be a good idea, especially with something like Mindbender. If you only hold that, you're going to stop getting as many uses out of it, and it's not going to be that strong. Now, again, you do want to keep in mind that fight timer. If the fight's about to end, you're only going to get one left. Sync it with other cooldowns. Otherwise, you can just pop that sucker on cooldown. Again, Void Torrent here, similar to other spells that we have. Outside the opener, Void Torrent should ideally be used right after you've refreshed Devouring Plague, or at worst case when Devouring Plague has at least 3 seconds left on it to get that full mastery benefit out of every tick of Void Torrent. This is going to be a little bit of a battle. It's going to be something that new players are going to struggle with a little bit, is lining that up and making sure you're delaying Devouring Plague enough to make sure you have that line up perfectly. As you get more haste, this will become easier to do, but make sure that when you're casting Void Torrent later on, you do ideally have all 3 dots up. Now, if you're in the situation where you don't have all 3 dots up, or maybe Devouring Plague only has like 1 or 2 seconds left, and Mind Blast is on cooldown, you literally have nothing else to press. At that point, it's probably better to use a Void Torrent just to get you out of the weeds there, rather than just sitting there mind flaying for 5 to 10 seconds to get the Insanity Generation. Usually that desyncing of Void Torrent will start costing you use cases, or uses of that cooldown throughout the fight, so be very, very careful with that. Shadow Crash, we already mentioned, you do want to save Shadow Crash if ads are coming in about 10 seconds or less. Otherwise, use that guy on cooldown. Be very careful with this. It's only as good as the player casting it, right? You need to make sure that you're actually hitting all the targets as much as possible. If you're not, maybe better to talent into something else like AS or other things, right? Okay, so the last big thing we want to cover here is Mind Flay and Mind Seer usage. So with this kind of different like channel filler abilities, we do have a bit of different use cases here. For the most part, Mind Flay is going to be used up to 3 targets. Once you get to 3 or more targets, you can go and swap into Mind Seer instead. Otherwise, you're just going to be mind flaying on those 1 to 2 targets. This is for 2 reasons. One, it's priority target damage, which is usually what you want. And then also from an insanity generation perspective, Mind Seer doesn't start getting really, really good until that 3 target point. Otherwise, you're kind of going to be kind of lagging behind a bit where you should have been casting Mind Flay instead. So keep that in mind. Now, because we have a rework to the spec a little bit, Mind Flay has become a bit better priority, especially if you're running the Eternal Call to the Void Legendary. You do want to kind of be more aggressive about weaving in Mind Flay ticks as much as possible throughout a fight. And also we have a new passive called Dark Thoughts. So Dark Thoughts is not going to change our rotation up that substantially. You do just want to keep in mind the proc. It does last a reasonable amount of time, but you do want to make sure you get the most out of it. Now, that being said, if you're inside a void form or on AoE and you're just like, I have so many things to use, letting it expire is okay. It's not the end of the world. Excuse me. Mind Blast is not, the best spell that we have. It's fine, especially in single target. It's definitely better there. It's mostly there for the insane generation that we get from it. That being said, with Dark Thoughts, it might be tempting to use the Dark Thoughts Mind Blast to as you're moving. I would not advise this at all. You're almost always better off using it while channeling Mind Flay or Mind Seer, because you can do that with the Dark Thoughts proc. Now, be a little careful with this because you don't want to overcap Insanity, but that's usually going to be a better bet throughout the fight. Now, if Dark Thoughts is expiring and you have to move for whatever reason, it's okay to use that charge while moving there. It's just ideally you would have used it earlier. Now, it is still bugged in the game. I will mention it here. This might get fixed at some point. You can actually use those Dark Thought procs inside of Void Torrent as well if you really, really want. But again, be very careful about capping Insanity. It'd be pretty easy there on single target especially. But, is what it is. So that's kind of like our all these lists of cooldowns that we have inside of single target. The last thing that I'll mention here that is kind of single target focused a little bit is Dissonant Echoes. So we do have a few conduits like Distant Echoes, Mind Devour, things like this that do give us procs to react to. The Distant Echoes one is the big one I want to highlight here, because when you do get that proc outside of Void form, you want to cherish that sucker really, really well, right? Because it will give you a Hungering Void debuff on whatever target you're using on, which is very, very valuable, assuming you're talented into that. So it's okay to bank up that proc a little bit if you have Void Torrent coming up in 2 seconds, if you have, Mind Games, whatever you have coming up to kind of line up with that debuff. So keep that in mind as well. But guys, for the most part, that is single target. Let's kind of move on to how this changes up what we're doing in an AoE situation. Okay, so when you're in an AoE situation on your Shadow Priest, things will change up a little bit. In fact, they usually get simpler more than anything. The one thing you want to keep in mind is when spells stop becoming worth. So we have a lot of spells that are maybe more single target focused or maybe harder to keep up in AoE. So I'm going to put up this list real quick. This is basically your AoE cheat sheet. This is what you want to keep in mind, and this is kind of what you want to work into your brain slowly but surely. Again, this will take practice to do kind of naturally, but the big ones are going to come kind of early on. So starting off here in this kind of cheat sheet of things, is Devouring Plague and Searing Nightmare. So Searing Nightmare is going to be your dominant AoE talent that you're going to take in almost all Mythic Plus scenarios. In rating, less so, but it's very important to understand because it costs Insanity. You're basically going to be kind of choosing between, hey, am I using my Insanity for Devouring Plague or Searing Nightmare instead? And that choice is very, very important. Obviously, Searing Nightmare does cost less Insanity than Devouring Plague, so we can be a bit more liberal with that usage. But Devouring Plague hits very, very hard, and again, it does scale with our mastery very, very well. Okay, so on 1 to 3 targets, you're still going to cast Devouring Plague most of the time. The only thing that will change up here on 3 targets is that you will start Searing Nightmare outside of Void form. So if we kind of think about it in that way, Devouring Plague is going to be the only spender that you cast from 1 to 2 targets. And then on 3 targets, you swap that guy out for outside of Void form and only use Searing Nightmare outside of Void form. Now, once you're inside of Void form, that's when Devouring Plague comes in. You can start trying to maintain Devouring Plague on multiple targets at that 3 target mark. Now, the same kind of holds true, the same cutoff, I guess I should say, with Mind Blast. You're only going to be casting Mind Blast from 1 to 3 targets. You will drop that at 4 or more targets without Dark Thought procs. And this is kind of where Dark Thoughts really comes in handy, because you're going to be casting a lot of Mind Seers on big AoE, and you can still weave in those Dark Thought Mind Blast while channeling Mind Seer, especially if you're kind of starting to starve for Insanity a little bit. Now, with that being said, once you hit that 4 target threshold, this is where Searing Nightmare will fully overtake Devouring Plague, even inside of Void form. So 3-4 targets, this is the big cutoff here, because 3 targets is also when you swap out Mind Seer for Mind Flay as well. So if you can keep up those, these are like the big important ones, everything else will kind of fall in the line more or less. Now, once we get into very high levels of AoE, I'm only putting these numbers out there. You won't encounter them quite as often as we used to because of all the target capping they've done. Running into this many mobs doesn't happen as often. But at 5 or more targets, you will drop Void Bolt without talenting into Hungering Void, and that'll be 6 or more targets if you do have Hungering Void, is when you stop using those Void Bolts. Now, generally speaking, you're going to be kind of switching up conduits. If you do have Dissonant Echoes, that will help this out a little bit, but generally speaking, it doesn't affect these cutoffs, so keep that in mind. You're going to want to probably swap that out, or maybe care a little bit less about that in AoE anyway, so there you go. Now, the other thing I want to talk about in terms of this AoE cheat sheet is Vampiric Touch. So for the most part, we really don't have to worry about Shadow Word Pain in AoE. That's more or less what Searing Nightmare is there for us to do. But we do need to worry about Vampiric Touch, specifically when you're not using Misery. This gets a little bit more challenging. Now, when you're using Misery, assuming the targets are all going to live a very long time, you're basically going to cast Vampiric Touch on everything, and your whole goal there is to maintain dots. But if you're using Searing Nightmare, Vampiric Touch is still very, very important because of that mastery benefit that we get from it. So the things you want to keep in mind there on our 5 or more targets, you will stop casting Vampiric Touch inside of Void form. Ideally, you're not doing this anyway. You do want to make sure things are dotted before going into Void form, ideally. Rather be spending that time doing Mind Seers and Searing Nightmares, but there you go. And then the only time you stop casting Vampiric Touch with Searing Nightmare is pretty much on 8 or more targets is the kind of safe bet. And this is really just because, you're generating so much insanity, you're just going to be outputting so many Searing Nightmares, the rest of it doesn't really matter. I would definitely suggest, though, when you're in AoE kind of scenarios, your whole goal is to kind of game these Vampiric Touches as much as possible. So typically, if you're pulling a pack that has 4 mobs, to get to 8, you're probably double pulling. And this is where, casting Fae, doing Vampiric Touch on the first 4 sets of mobs, and then Vampiric Touch on the last set later is going to come in a lot of handy and start saving you that time before you hit this 8 target threshold. So this is the cheat sheet. This is the thing you want to keep in mind with AoE, right? The rest of the AoE rotation is actually very, very straightforward. For the most part, you're just going to be Mind Searing and Searing Nightmare. Again, if you do have Misery, you'll be doing dots on everything, and you're just mostly just weaving in your spells as you would inside that single target rotation, as you can see behind me. Now, the one thing I want to call out here in AoE that does change up things a little bit, and might be a bit less intuitive, is Searing Nightmare specifically. So, Searing Nightmare, if you don't know, can only be cast while channeling a Mind Seer, which means you only have the duration of a single Mind Seer channel to cast Searing Nightmare, which does incur the GCD. Now, because of this and because of our shifting haste levels, remember Mind Seer's channel is affected by haste, the more haste you have, the harder it's going to be to fit in all these Searing Nightmares. Now, generally speaking, this gets even worse with Lust or Power Infusion. So because of that and because of our changing haste values, you almost always want to only do 2 Searing Nightmares per Mind Seer channel. Excuse me. Now, some of you might, have really low haste or be like, hey, I think I can fit in that third one here. This is almost never a good idea because we kind of want a continuous Mind Seer channel to keep that insanity flowing in at all times. If you do 3 Searing Nightmares within a Mind Seer channel, you will drop a Mind Seer for a global or 2 and then have to recast it and bring that back up. If you do 2, you can easily weave in Mind Seer, 2 Searing Nightmares, Mind Seer. And this is going to be kind of your whole rotation in AoE is going back and forth on this system. And this is going to basically be what you're doing. Now, the only thing that you will break that Mind Seer channel for is things like Void Bolt on lower target counts. Maybe you have to move or cast Shadow Crash. That's okay to break this. But trying to fit in that Searing Nightmare usually is going to cause more problems than it will solve. So make sure you're only doing ever 2 Searing Nightmares per a Mind Seer channel. All right, guys, that is it for AoE for the most part. That cheat sheet is going to basically be your go-to, the thing you want to keep in mind. Some of these talents like Void Torrent or others will be a bit iffy on these higher target counts, but you're typically not taking those talents anyway, so don't worry too much about that. They're not really going to change up what you're doing. All right, guys, so this is just kind of the opening gambit of the Shadow Priest rotation. There's a lot more to talk about. I know I kind of went a bit rambly there. There's a lot to cover in terms of cooldowns, when to use what. A lot of it is you just need to find the rhythm of your cooldowns, line up your cooldowns as much as possible, and use them as much as possible, and you'll be good to go. Now, outside of that, if you guys have other questions or if you think I missed something, please take a look at the Icy Veins guide in the description below. This is going to be a bit more in-depth about, what spells to cast when, kind of a bit more edge cases that I'll cover there that make a bit more sense to read rather than me kind of talking through them. So make sure you check that out. If you do have other questions, feel free to leave a comment below or ping me in Discord or whatever. I'll try to get to you guys as soon as I can. That is it for the rotation guide for Shadow Priest for this video. Make sure to come back tomorrow in the next couple days for the Castle Nathria and Mythic Plus guides specifically. Thank you so much to the patrons that are supporting me in this crazy guide series. I know it's been a while since I've done videos. Hopefully this has been helpful for you guys and in your kind of Shadow Priest journey here. All right. Thank you so much for watching. We'll see you in the next one.